The sun burned high over the golden dunes of Niboria, a land where legends were born and forgotten in the same breath. It was a kingdom carved between the desert and the river, where the air itself carried the scent of fire and dust. And in that land lived a man whose name echoed louder than any drumbeat of war, Toba, the Lion of Niboria. He was not born in a palace, nor raised by noble blood. His story began in the streets, barefoot, hungry, and driven by something far greater than pride, purpose. The people said he was touched by destiny, a warrior molded not by privilege but by pain. From the burning deserts to the roaring rivers, from the tribal villages to the palace gates, there was one name everyone respected. Toba. The warrior who never bowed, the soldier who stood when others fell. And when he fought, he didn't fight for gold or fame, he fought for the people who had nothing to lose. The king of Niboria, Raja Okoro, saw that light in him. While others looked at Toba and saw a servant, the king saw a lion disguised as a man. So he brought him into the palace, trained him, trusted him, and in time, Toba became not just a soldier, but the beating heart of the empire. Years passed, and Toba's legend grew like wildfire. He fought wars at the edges of Niboria, defending farmers, guarding trade routes, crushing invasions that would have destroyed weaker men. His courage spread faster than any story told by the bards. Mothers whispered his name to calm their children. Soldiers sharpened their blades just to follow his lead. And wherever he went, the banner of Niboria stood taller. But with fame came shadows, and in the deepest corner of the palace, one shadow grew darker every day, Prince Jairo. The king's only son. Young, ambitious, and poisoned by envy. He had watched Toba rise from dust to glory, watched him command armies that once knelt to royal blood, and worst of all, watched his own father praise that servant more than him. To Jairo, every cheer for Toba sounded like mockery. Every victory Toba brought was another reminder that love could be earned, not inherited. And that wounded him in ways even a sword could not. He began to despise the man who had done nothing wrong, except exist in the light he could never stand beneath. Raja Okoro, wise and noble as he was, never saw the storm growing in his son's heart. To him, the kingdom's peace was all that mattered. After decades of war, Niboria was finally safe. The people celebrated. Drums echoed through the night, dancers painted their faces with gold, and the king raised a cup of wine in the palace courtyard, the same cup that would seal his fate. Unseen by all, Prince Jairo slipped through the crowd, his face hidden beneath the shadow of the torches. His hand trembled as he poured a few drops of poison into the royal chalice. Perhaps he hesitated for a moment. Perhaps not. But that night, as laughter filled the kingdom, silence awaited at dawn. The next morning, the king's servants found Raja Okoro on the floor of his chamber, cold and breathless. And before anyone could question what had happened, Prince Jairo stepped forward, his voice steady, his eyes full of false grief, and said the words that shattered Toba's life forever. It was Toba, he cried. He poisoned the king. He wanted the throne for himself. In that moment, the hero of Niboria became its enemy. The royal court turned into a storm of rage and disbelief. Toba, still wearing the armor he had bled for, stood in silence as guards, the same men he had trained and protected, raised their swords against him. His eyes searched the room for truth, for reason, for anything human left in the hearts of those he'd once called brothers. But there was none. Fear is louder than loyalty, and in that silence, fear ruled them all. I did not do this, Toba said, his voice calm but heavy. My sword is stained with the blood of your enemies, not your king. But his words were swallowed by the crowd's roar. Jairo pointed at him, screaming betrayal, and the court obeyed. No trial. No mercy. Just the cold echo of Jairo's command, throw him into the pit of beasts. Let his loyalty be eaten alive. The guards seized him, dragging him through the corridors he had walked with pride. Torches flickered as they reached the edge of the underground pit, a place meant for execution, filled with venomous snakes and wild creatures that hadn't seen light in years. The king's banner still hung above, fluttering faintly in the night breeze, as if even it mourned what was about to happen. Without a final word, they pushed him in. The world fell into darkness. When he hit the ground, pain screamed through every bone in his body. Around him, the air was thick with the hiss of serpents and the growls of unseen beasts. Blood trickled from his arm, and the scent of it stirred the pit's hunger. For hours, he fought not just to survive, but to stay sane. Every breath felt like fire, every sound like death whispering in his ear. But somewhere in that darkness, a small crack of light shimmered through a corner of the stone wall. A tunnel, narrow, hidden, and half-collapsed. Perhaps no one knew it existed. Perhaps fate had carved it for this very moment. Crawling through the mud, wounded and trembling, Toba pushed himself into that passage. It took him hours to reach the other side, where the cool air of the jungle touched his face again. He had lost everything, his honor, his home, his king, but not his soul. As dawn broke over Niboria, the world believed Toba was dead. Yet in the silence of the trees, the lion of Niboria still breathed. And though vengeance burned quietly within him, he whispered to the wind, "If truth is buried, then I will wait, until the earth itself speaks for me." For many months, the jungle was Toba's only companion. He wandered through the tangled roots and mist-covered valleys, carrying the weight of a name that no longer belonged to him. The scars on his body healed faster than the ones on his heart. Every night, when the wind howled through the trees, it sounded like the voices of the soldiers he had once commanded, men who had turned their blades against him. But Toba did not curse them. He understood the sickness of fear, he had seen it in their eyes. So instead of hatred, he carried silence. He built himself a small hut near the riverbank where the moonlight fell like silver dust. There he began a new life, one without titles, one without armor. The villagers from nearby settlements slowly came to know the quiet man who appeared after storms to rebuild their roofs, who treated the wounds of their children, who hunted only to feed the hungry. To them, he was not the lion of Niboria. He was simply Toba, the man who never turned away when someone cried for help. He found peace in humility, and in the laughter of those who had nothing. Yet beneath that peace, the memory of betrayal burned like an ember that refused to die. Sometimes, as he gazed across the river toward the distant walls of the palace, he would whisper the name of his fallen king. "I will not forget you, my liege. The truth still breathes." Inside those palace walls, however, truth was the first casualty. Prince Jairo had crowned himself King Jairo the day after his father's death. The coronation was rushed, the mourning short, and the celebration loud enough to drown the doubts of the people. He promised prosperity, strength, and unity, the usual lies of insecure rulers. But power revealed the cracks that envy had already carved in him. The soldiers he once feared, he now commanded with cruelty. He raised taxes on the farmers, seized grain from the poor, and turned every council into a court of praise where only his voice mattered. The songs that once spoke of Toba's bravery were banned, those who whispered his name were punished. Yet the people remembered. In the markets, in the far villages, in the small gatherings by candlelight, mothers told their children stories of the lion who had saved them from invaders, the same lion whom the palace had buried in lies. If Toba were alive, they would sigh, the land would not weep like this. And weep it did. Seasons grew harsher. The rains came late and left early. Crops wilted under a pitiless sun. The river that had once glistened like glass began to shrink, inch by inch, until the stones beneath it showed their teeth. But Jairo blamed everyone but himself, the farmers, the gods, the ghosts of old wars. He built more statues of himself than granaries for his people. In his greed to be remembered, he forgot to rule. Meanwhile, in the silence of the jungle, Toba heard the cries of a kingdom breaking. Merchants who fled the cities brought stories of hunger and fear. Mothers carried their dying children across the plains in search of food. Even the river by which he lived had grown thinner, its fish disappearing as if the water itself mourned. Toba spent his days helping as many as he could, carrying sacks of grain from one village to another, teaching young men how to defend their homes from bandits who roamed freely under the corrupt king's nose. The children began calling him Uncle Toba, though none knew who he truly was. He smiled at the innocence of it. At night, when the fire crackled outside his hut, he often found himself staring into the flames, seeing faces from his past, Raja Okoro's kind eyes, the guards who had betrayed him, and Jairo's trembling hand pouring poison into the cup. The images haunted him, but they no longer controlled him. Vengeance is loud, he would whisper to the fire, but truth is patient. And so he waited. He believed that someday, fate would open its door. And when that day came, he would not step through it for revenge, but to bring the kingdom back to balance. That day arrived sooner than he expected. One morning, the jungle air smelled different, dry, sharp, lifeless. The last stream that fed the villages had vanished overnight. The drought had reached its cruelest peak. The people of Niboria began to move in great numbers toward the capital, desperate and angry. Toba followed them from a distance, his heart heavy as he saw mothers carrying empty pots and fathers with eyes that had forgotten hope. When they reached the palace gates, the crowd swelled into a sea of hunger and fury. They shouted the name of the king, demanded water, justice, answers, anything. But from the marble balcony above, Jairo appeared wrapped in gold, his face pale with fear and pride. Instead of comfort, he gave them soldiers. Instead of mercy, he gave them orders. The crowd scattered under the strike of whips, yet their voices did not die, they grew louder. And that was when the first chant broke through the chaos, rising from somewhere deep within the mob, Toba lives. Toba lives. The word spread like fire. Jairo froze. For a moment, it seemed even the sky held its breath. Because deep in his heart, the tyrant knew the truth he had buried might be walking toward him. And indeed, it was. From the horizon of dust and despair, a figure appeared, cloaked, steady, and familiar to the people long before they could see his face. Toba had returned. Not as a ghost or a warrior seeking vengeance, but as a man carrying truth. The villagers recognized him first, their shouts turned into tears. Soldiers hesitated, unsure whether to draw their swords or fall to their knees. Jairo tried to laugh it off, it cannot be. He's dead. But the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Toba raised his hand, and the noise of the crowd softened. In that silence, he spoke with the calmness of a river finally finding its way home. You called me a traitor, he said. But the traitor sits upon the throne. Then, from among the people, an old man stepped forward, the royal healer, frail but alive, the one who had seen Jairo mix the poison years ago. His voice shook as he confessed everything before the crowd. There was no denying it anymore. The truth that Toba had waited for had finally spoken through the earth itself. The soldiers dropped their weapons. The same hands that had thrown Toba into the pit now reached out to help him stand upon the palace steps. Jairo collapsed, his crown slipping from his head, his pride shattered by the weight of his own guilt. Kill me, Toba, he whispered, trembling. You deserve this throne more than I ever did. But Toba looked at him with quiet eyes and said, No, a true warrior does not seek revenge. He seeks balance. The crowd fell silent as Toba's words hung in the air, heavy, pure, unforgettable. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if afraid to disturb the weight of mercy that had just been spoken. Jairo knelt before him, trembling, his once golden crown rolling across the palace floor like a broken promise. No sword was drawn. No blood was spilled. For the first time in decades, Niboria witnessed a victory that came not from war, but from wisdom. Toba turned to the people, faces he had fought for, faces he had once lost faith in, and raised his voice. No man shall ever hold this crown again, he declared. For a kingdom that belongs to one is doomed to fall. But a kingdom that belongs to its people will never die. The roar that followed was not of chaos, but of awakening. Men and women fell to their knees, not in fear, but in gratitude. The soldiers, still in their armor, lifted their spears in salute, knowing that the legend they had buried was standing before them, alive, unbroken, and forgiving. That day, the throne of Niboria was dismantled. In its place, Toba created something new, the Council of Niboria, where every voice would be heard and every village would have a hand in guiding the land. It was not the rule of kings anymore, it was the birth of balance. In the weeks that followed, the kingdom began to breathe again. The farmers returned to their fields with hope rekindled in their eyes. The river, once dry and lifeless, began to flow again, not by miracle, but by unity. Villagers from all regions gathered to repair the dams, to plant seeds, to build water channels that fed even the most forgotten lands. The music of Niboria returned, children's laughter replaced the echoes of hunger. Where Jero's statues once stood, people built wells and gardens. And though the sun still blazed fiercely across the desert, its heat no longer felt cruel. It felt alive, like the pulse of a reborn nation. Toba refused every offer of leadership. "I am only a servant," he said softly, "and servants do not sit on thrones." Instead, he worked alongside the people, carrying stones, planting trees, teaching young warriors that strength meant more than the sword. He rebuilt the palace not as a fortress, but as a hall for all, a place of truth, judgment, and peace. When the council met for the first time, they asked Toba to speak, but he only smiled and said, "You already know what must be done. Lead with the heart, not with fear." His humility became the new law, his silence the new wisdom. As the years passed, stories of Toba's mercy spread far beyond Niboria's borders. Travelers came from distant lands to see the man who had been betrayed yet chose forgiveness over vengeance. Bards sang his tale under starlit skies, and children grew up knowing his name not as a warrior, but as a symbol of patience, loyalty, and truth. King Jero lived out his days in quiet exile, wandering among the very people he once ignored, carrying his shame like a crown he could never remove. And Toba, the lion of Niboria, lived simply until his final breath. On certain nights, when the moonlight touched the river and the air grew still, he would walk to the same riverbank where his journey of exile had begun. There, he would look across the water, remembering the faces of those he had loved and lost, and whisper to the night, "Loyalty never dies, it only waits to be seen again." The water shimmered, as if the spirits of Niboria answered him. And though centuries would pass, the kingdom he rebuilt, the one born not from blood, but from truth, would forever remember the man who proved that greatness does not come from a crown, but from the courage to forgive. Generations passed, and Niboria changed. The deserts that once burned with war now shimmered with peace. The sound of swords was replaced by the rhythm of hammers and drums, building homes, schools, and bridges that connected every tribe of the land. The Council of Niboria became the heart of the kingdom, a circle where the old and the young sat together, where ideas were worth more than bloodlines. Yet, even as the years washed away the memory of kings and battles, the name Toba lived on. Not as a story carved in stone, but as a spirit whispered between generations. Children grew up learning that true strength was not in conquering others, but in conquering oneself. Elders told them, "A lion does not roar to be feared, he roars to remind the jungle that he still protects." And whenever drought threatened or conflict arose, the people would gather by the riverbank, the same river where Toba once walked, and light torches in his honor. They said the flame's reflection on the water was the sign that his spirit still watched over Niboria. His legacy was no longer flesh and bone. It was a way of life, quiet, noble, and unshakable. But even peace must be protected. As centuries rolled on, new rulers came, some wise, some proud, and a few who had forgotten the lessons of the lion. Power began to whisper again in dark corners. Greed dressed itself in noble words. There were councils that argued more than they acted, leaders who spoke of unity but sought only their own glory. Yet every time the kingdom neared the edge of corruption, the stories of Toba would rise like a storm from the hearts of the people. They would remind their leaders of the man who refused the throne, the man who chose balance over blood. Farmers carved his name on the handles of their plows. Soldiers painted his symbol, a lion silhouette, on their shields before battle. Even the scholars of Niboria would begin their lessons with the old prayer, "Let our hands be strong like Toba's, but our hearts be gentle as his mercy." And somehow, each time, the kingdom found its way back. The legend of Toba had become more than history. It was the invisible hand that steadied Niboria whenever it trembled, the unseen voice that whispered in moments of darkness, "Remember who you are, and whom you serve." One night, many generations later, an old storyteller stood before a crowd of children under the same moon that had once shone upon Toba's river. His voice was rough with age, but his eyes glimmered with fire. "They say," he began, "that every river remembers the steps of those who walked beside it. And when the moonlight touches the water, it whispers their names back to the world." The children leaned closer, eyes wide, hearts open. "So when you hear the river sing," the old man continued, "that is not the sound of water, it is the voice of the lion, reminding you that loyalty, truth, and courage never die." The firelight danced on their faces, and for a moment, it felt as if the very air held the spirit of the man they spoke of. The storyteller looked at the stars and smiled. "The kingdom you see around you, its peace, its strength, its beauty, it did not come from kings or crowns. It came from one man's choice to forgive." The night grew quiet again, and in the soft hush of the wind, the children thought they could almost hear the faint roar of a lion carried across the dunes, not fierce, not violent, but proud and eternal. The sound of a promise kept through time. The sound of the lion of Niboria, still watching, still guiding, still alive in the heart of his people. And from that night onward, something within him began to shift, not all at once, not with fireworks or epiphanies, but with the quiet force of someone who finally understood the weight of time. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with fog and whispers of self-doubt, but there was a new rhythm in his steps now. He had learned that progress doesn't announce itself with applause, it arrives in the smallest, most silent victories, the decision to rise one more time, to write one more page, to believe when no one else does. He woke up earlier, not out of obligation, but out of purpose. His mornings became sacred rituals, breathing in hope, exhaling fear. He stopped waiting for motivation to strike and started relying on discipline, on the raw power of habit. He understood that dreams were not built in the comfort of inspiration but in the grind of repetition. And as he watched the sun rise through his window, he whispered to himself, "This is how I rebuild me. One step. One breath. One day at a time." The people around him began to notice a change, not the kind measured in possessions or titles, but in presence. He no longer rushed to fill silences, he allowed them to breathe. He no longer sought approval, he gave it to himself. There was a calmness in his words, a conviction in his actions. He started seeing failure differently, not as an enemy, but as a mirror showing him where to grow. He revisited the memories that once haunted him and realized that pain had been his greatest teacher all along. Every heartbreak, every rejection, every sleepless night, they had not broken him, they had built him. And so he forgave, not because they deserved it, but because he deserved peace. He stopped trying to rewrite the past and started writing his future. And it was then, in the stillness of self-acceptance, that he discovered the rarest kind of strength, the kind that doesn't roar but endures, quietly, persistently, beautifully. With time, he became more intentional about who he let into his world. He learned that not everyone could walk with him on this new path, and that was okay. He stopped chasing people who made him feel small. He started seeking those who saw the fire in him and refused to let it die. He surrounded himself with those who spoke of ideas, purpose, and growth, not gossip, envy, and fear. He began to understand that energy was currency, and where he spent it determined the richness of his life. So he guarded his peace like a treasure. He learned the art of saying no without guilt, of saying yes only when it aligned with his truth. He stopped being available to everything that drained him, and as he did, his world started expanding in ways he never imagined. The right people appeared, the right opportunities unfolded, and for the first time, he realized that alignment was not luck, it was the reward for authenticity. But even with all this progress, he knew the battle wasn't over. There were still days when the old fears returned, when the voice of doubt whispered that he wasn't enough, that he was pretending, that one mistake could unravel everything he'd built. Yet this time, he didn't run from it. He sat with it. He listened. And then, gently, he spoke back. Maybe I'm not perfect, he'd say. But I'm trying. And trying is more than I ever gave myself credit for. The difference now was that he didn't seek to erase the pain, he sought to understand it. He realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was moving forward in spite of it. So, on those quiet nights when uncertainty pressed heavy on his chest, he'd look up at the ceiling and remind himself, "You've come too far to only come this far." And with that thought, he'd rise again, tired but undefeated, fragile but unbroken. Then came the moment that tested everything he had become. An opportunity, massive, terrifying, and uncertain, stood before him. The kind of chance that could either define him or destroy him. A younger version of him would have hesitated, overthought, maybe even run away. But this version, forged in pain and persistence, knew better. He took a deep breath, looked at his reflection, and said, "You're ready." Not because the fear was gone, but because the belief had grown stronger. And when he took that leap, into the unknown, into the storm, something magical happened. The universe didn't hand him instant success, but it handed him momentum. And in that momentum, he found everything he'd been searching for, not fame, not validation, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was finally living as the man he was always meant to be. The man who stopped waiting for the world to save him, because he learned how to save himself.